Hi, my name is Graham Brookie. I'm the director and managing editor of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm so thrilled to welcome somebody who I've learned a lot from, and a friend, Maria Ressa, who is the CEO of Rappler, for our latest coffee talk. So it's early where I am, it's late where Maria is. Welcome, Maria. Thank you so much for doing this.
For having me. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you. And there's a new documentary out that is essentially about Maria's experience over the last few years called 1,000 Cuts, and it was just released.
We're sitting now with Davao Mayor Rodrigo Duterte. Thank you for joining us.
Salamat sa panahon mo.
Can you please, you are the man of the hour. People wanted to know whether you're running for president, vice president, yes, no. Where are you?
I told you to avoid me. I'm telling the Filipino people, wag ako, it's gonna be bloody.
So no qualms about killing killers.
Yes, of course. I must admit that I have killed. They 3 months early on, I killed about 3 people.
It's a phrase that you have used to describe President Duterte of the Philippines' government in increasing authoritarian attempts to undermine democracy there in the Philippines. How does that, well, first and foremost, where does the name come from, and what is it like? What's going on right now?
I think you would recognize it because it came from Al-Qaeda. That was actually, I remember going through all of this stuff when we were doing terrorism research, going through the documents. And I remember the last time I saw it was AQAP in Inspire, where they talked about the strategy of death by 1,000 cuts. And it's, in Al-Qaeda's sense, it was asymmetrical warfare because they were fighting such a big power and they would chop bit by bit, right? And it would be, I think it would, to bleed, you get so many of these little cuts, you ignore them, but in the end you're bleeding out and you die. It came back to me when all of the attacks online began. And that happened to me in 2016. And as a journalist, that I was just shocked by this. We did a 3-part series on the propaganda war, weaponizing the internet. And I wrote 2 of the 3 pieces there. The second piece was how Facebook algorithms impact democracy. This is in 2016. And right after, I was inundated and I began to count the attacks. And it was an average of 90 hate messages per hour. And I realized that I was responding, but they didn't want to talk to me. They didn't want to have a rational discussion. It was about pounding me to silence. It was about making me doubt myself, right? And then over time, it's about killing my reputation, credibility. So it accomplishes 2 things. It makes me doubt myself. It actually, for a little while, prevented me from doing more stories like that because it has an impact on Rappler. I lead this company. And then the second thing is it creates a bandwagon, a manufactured consensus. It's a fake bandwagon effect. And it's meant to convince other people. They seed narratives, like in this one, in my case, it was in 2016, seeding journalist equals criminal. And in 2016, it was laughable. But in 2017, when President Duterte says the same thing top down, you get sandwiched in between. People begin to believe it. And then the weaponization of the law followed in 2018, 11 cases. And 2019, 8 arrest warrants. I was arrested twice in a 5-week period. And then, of course, 2020, I was the first of the 8 cases. I was convicted for, let's see, for a story I didn't write, edit, or supervise, for violating a law supposedly that didn't exist when we published the story 8 years ago. I mean, it's bizarre. Anyway, sorry. So 1,000 cuts is that bleeding out. I was first thinking about it for myself. Then I began to see uh, the the law caving in from within, and this is not just happening in the Philippines. Bottom up attacks. A populist leader gets elected using this kind of scorched earth policy on social media. Once they're elected, they use the formal levers of power, the tools of democracy, and then they crumble it from within. Institutions just crumble. In the Philippines, I think our institutions crumbled within 6 months. So death by 1,000 cuts.
In many ways, you experienced this before a lot of people, right? Disinformation is one of these things that's designed to intimidate us, that's designed to make us feel alone. In my view, disinformation, which is the spread of false information with intent, is a form of corruption for sure. And in many ways, when you describe the kind of comments, coordinated comments online, that's something that all of us can kind of conceptualize now. But if we were having this conversation when it was happening to you in 2016, it's not something you experienced it before. Death by 1,000 cuts, yes, in your personal experience, but also now death by 1,000 cuts in so many other places in the world, and including in one form or another here in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say that because, look, I think I was shocked that this was happening, and it's evolved over the last 4 years, right? The first is just pound you to silence. Then the second is the evolution of the networks. They seed these narratives to see which one takes root. Your reputation definitely is damaged. Credibility is under attack. And then I think the last part, which is where we are right now, after the conviction, right? It's really a goal to dehumanize you. Like, the attacks against me are so vile, and they're sexist at best, right? I guess that's the other part.
Like, diplomatically said, right? Like, that's a very nice term for what's happening to you on the internet right now.
It's shocking to me, and when I show some of this stuff, and I do show it, because why will you censor something that is in full view of everyone? But imagine waking up to this, and I guess part of what I realize is, in some way, shape, or form, women are attacked. Our database shows women are attacked 10 times more than men in the Philippines. And then I was going to say, in some way, shape, or form, the women in Rappler, we are 63% women, have some form of PTSD. Like, you fight back for sure, but it leaves an impact. And, I pick up my phone, and I know that if I say something, I will be attacked. And so I just prepare for it. But it's like pollution right now. And I guess this is part of the reason I run after Facebook, YouTube. These are the platforms. They're now the largest delivery platforms. They deliver the news. And so to deliver the kinds of attacks that I'm living through, that should be taken down. It is hate speech. So these definitions, I guess the last part is, I worry that when this kind of hate speech becomes the norm, that dehumanizing factor makes violence easier. And that's part of the reason I've increased security in Rappler. It's starting in 2016. We increased our security, we doubled it, and at a certain point, we hit 6 times the amount that we normally had. And, we're a little news group. Graham, you came and visited us. We're a little news group. So it's, it's not so easy anymore. But I guess part of what we hope is that enlightened self-interest on the part of the social media platforms of Silicon Valley.
Well, and we'll come back to the platforms in a minute. But when I visited you in 2017, you were thinking through what the strategy is here, right? Like, what is the response? Can we respond? Do we make this worse? Do we make this better? And I guess the question there is, how do you conceptualize protecting the newsroom, but you talk about stages, and you mentioned this is kind of an end stage. Is it actually the end stage, or can it get worse? Like, what is what are the worst things that could happen, because it has escalated every single time?
I think there are three things I want to answer there because they're all implicit in your question. The first part, what the conventional wisdom in 2016 is, don't respond, because news groups used to be the gatekeepers. And so if you don't respond, you don't amplify it. That is absolutely the wrong strategy. And I see Americans grappling with that now, right? If you have formal power, you think, don't respond. Well, if you don't respond, they will own the narrative and you will already have lost by default. So we learned you have to respond, because not only do you respond to protect yourself, because you can still get pounded, but you respond so that your community, your supporters know that this is a lie, or you give them a narrative. It's battling narratives. I think the second thing is to realize that this is not misinformation, but disinformation. And that's a pet peeve for me with American news groups, because in the States, you guys use misinformation so much, right? I think that's a small fraction, but let's use Facebook's words, coordinated inauthentic behavior, CIB. That may have been correct in 2016, but it's influence operations, meaning when you throw this kind of, let's call it the virus of lies, right? So we'll put pandemic and lies together. So you throw it into a closed system, it infects real people. And when they're infected, they change the way they think and the way they act. So fast forward, look at the United States. In 2016, the Mueller report actually already documented that that Americans were targeted by Russian disinformation. And it, like in the Philippines, they took fracture lines of the society, in your case, identity politics, and they manipulated both sides of Black Lives Matter. Fast forward, right? So influence operations, and fast forward over 4 years to 2020, and look at where America was in 2020. You exacerbate that with the pandemic, and real people are changed. Society has changed. So that's the second point. I think the third point is online violence leads to real world violence. And we know this from the terrorist attacks. The synagogue in Pennsylvania, it's like so many different instances, the New Zealand, so many. And to not protect, to allow this exponential hate and violence to infect other people, real people who can then carry out the violence, it is so irresponsible. Anyway, so you can see, so what we tried to do in Rappler is protect every step. So number one was respond, build networks, tell our people what is happening, report it, look at the data. That's how we fought back, with data. And it's the only weapon journalists have is to shine the light. And I am so glad we did that in 2016. At that point, our managing editor actually told me, you should stop doing these types of stories because you get attacked and Rappler gets attacked. I'm glad we did it in 2016, because if we didn't, our communities, our people would have been far more vulnerable by at least doing it then. It's like terrorism again, right? You have to tell people there is a threat, and this is insidious manipulation. So that. I think the second one is we have to be aware that it is literally changing the world we live in. And the third is that it's not going to stop here. And that's why I worry about US elections. Right now, the social media platforms, they have us against them mentality built into the design of the platform. It is not a coincidence that the leaders who use that tactic of us against them, who divide society, do the best on these platforms. And then the second thing is the data has already proven that lies laced with anger and hate spread fastest, and further than really boring facts. We don't stand a chance. This is journalism. Facts is a thinking slow process, traveling on platforms that are built for thinking fast, that are optimized for thinking fast, that takes human nature and turns it upside down. So it's not we, If your Silicon Valley companies do not change what they have created, democracy will die. If you don't have facts, how can you have integrity of elections, right? A lie told a million times becomes a fact.
Right. Well, and if we don't have a shared set of facts, then how can we make collective decisions, which is how democracy works, right?
Correct. And again, it's not a coincidence that when you don't have facts, you can't have truth, you can't have trust. All those three are necessary to have a democracy. So, I think it's an existential moment. I mean, certainly in my country, it is. And that's the reason why, Graham, you know me, I haven't stopped talking, but I really know how Sisyphus feels, how Cassandra feels. I mean, gosh, I wish the world was different.
Yeah. One of the things that you said that resonates with me, because we're making this point, in any of the places where we are working, is the difference between misinformation and disinformation. And misinformation, we define as the spread of false information without intent, right? And it's a little bit more forgivable. It's, like we all have a family member that spreads misinformation on a pretty regular basis, and you kind of face palm and say, oh my God, like, hey, if you could just check the source, or, if you could just do this or read the article first before you share it. And then there's disinformation, which is malicious, right? Those who spread disinformation are meaning to manipulate, or are meaning to lie at scale in order to gain advantage. And it's corruption. Again, it's corruption. The struggle with that, with newsrooms calling, not distinguishing between the two, is that it kind of gives the people who are spreading disinformation an apology, right? It lets them off the hook for what they're actually meaning to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's a free pass, right? It gives them, and I think that's part of it. I mean, we saw this thing happen, and finding the right words, calling a spade, getting the data to support that. This isn't, it's disinformation, and it is global. I think we began to see, beginning in 2017, the studies that started showing how cheap armies on social media was rolling back democracy in many countries around the world. In 2017, it was like in 28 countries. It was Freedom House that came out with the same one. 2018 and 2019. So 2018, it doubled to 48. In 2019, Oxford Computational Propaganda Research Project brought it to 70 countries. 2020, I'm waiting, but with COVID, it is, I think we've just fast-tracked getting people online, and social media grew, Facebook grew, right? So disinformation, you can't solve the problem until you name it.
It's like, let me focus you first on what's happening in the entire information ecosystem. It's dark and light. Let me use that now, right? They're trying to actively form alternative news, and they've succeeded. Trending News Portal was a really good distribution. Mocha is a really good distribution. That's why all of a sudden our society is so polarized, because that's what they're doing. This group just amplifies, pounds, but they never share any of the traditional news sites. And then the traditional news sites are so blind that they don't even see they're getting killed here, right? This is fascinating. It's a snapshot of our information ecosystem today.
When you talk about response and the strategy of like, how do you actually respond to disinformation, or how do you get ahead of it? How do you get above it? How do you get around it? One of the things that we think a lot about is that disinformation is a trap, right? When you respond directly to some of the disinformation out there, you inadvertently kind of accept the premise of the disinformation to begin with, and then you're in a back and forth. And once you get into that back and forth, you've lost, because you're explaining whatever your position is that is sound and logical and based in facts and data-driven and evidence. And you've done a really good job of creating a platform that is resilient against that, and not necessarily having to, respond directly to every single falsehood or every single comment online, but explaining how it works. And that's where we come to this kind of concept of hold the line. What is hold the line, and what does it mean for you personally? What does it mean for your newsroom? But more broadly, what does it mean for all of us?
So before I answer that, let me take what you said about how do we deal with disinformation, right? Most of the early debate around this focused on content. And when you only look at content, that's when it becomes like a bottomless pit, because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Uh, and you don't want to get caught in that loop. What we looked at were the networks themselves. The networks spreading the lies. We're one of Facebook's fact-checking partners. And one of the reasons we did that is because once we fact-check it, we prove it's a lie, then we look at the networks that spread the lies, right? And those networks, this is in plain sight. It's like looking, again, terrorism research really helped us understand this. Hold the line came from, this was actually in the end of 2016 or 2017, when we were given an award, NDI. It was National Democratic Institute. Madeleine Albright gave the award, and I was trying to figure out precisely that. I am a journalist, and because I'm a journalist, I am not pro or anti Duterte, right?
You almost gave yourself off the hook for being a journalist. Maria, you're still writing things. You published something yesterday.
I am, but you know what? This is another one of those creative destruction moments, right? Because I'm facing, cumulatively, I can go to the maximum sentence is almost 100 years. And I'm having to do things that I would never have done as a journalist, which is to be far more activist when you're trying to protect the facts. It's not even the activism of journalism. It is beyond that. We have to create communities that understand if you don't protect the facts, we will lose everything, right? So anyway, where were we? I was back to hold the line, right? To being a journalist, because I feel like the propaganda machine, the pro-Duterte supporters started labeling us. The government began labeling us anti-government by pointing out the fact, right? How many people have died? Well, at a certain point, the police said they had killed 7,000 people. We kept them to their word, even after they rolled it back to 2,500 in plain sight, right? And that's, you've seen this happen in the United States. That's a prerogative of power. And in an environment like the Philippines, where violence and fear is a part of the air we breathe, when my reporter, starting July 2016, would come home every night and they would have videos of at least 8 dead bodies dumped on the sidewalk, it is a different time, right? When I face cases just for doing our jobs, it's a different time. So for me, at the beginning, I was thrown off by that. And I was, how do I defend against something like that? It's not true. I have to defend myself. And just like what you said, if you defend it, then you make it real. So that's where Hold the Line came in. Hold the Line was about, here is where the Constitution, Philippine Constitution is patterned after the United States. We have a Bill of Rights. So here, these are my rights. We will hold the line, because there's a bulldozer trying to push us off the line. And that goes to my death by 1,000 cuts. So hold the line means you fight for your rights. We live in that age now. We have to fight for our rights. We have to fight for democracy. Otherwise, we will lose it.
For me, hold the line is one of these things. What you're describing is something that we never thought could happen, right? Absolutely. What happens when norms just go out the window? And in democracy especially, right, there's so many things that glue this all together that aren't necessarily hard and fast rules or not accounted for by law. It kind of assumes that everybody is going to be coming to this in good faith and relying on facts. In the United States, for instance, we have fairness doctrine, as you know, and it's not fair if one of the sides that you have to give equal time to is totally out in left field and totally detached from reality and or facts.
So why should you care about what happens in the Philippines, right? For one, we spend the most time on the internet, more than 10 hours a day. We spend the most time on social media globally. And as we found out, lies laced with anger and hate spread fastest. When you only look at content, it's a whack-a-mole game. I want to figure out what the lie is, then look at the network that spreads the lies. That's the nervous system. We started looking at one account that was attacking all journalists are corrupt. One account that had 25 followers. They were all following each other. We fact-checked every single item. These were all fake accounts. We began to count and found that 26 fake accounts can influence up to 3 million other accounts. 3 million. I think the first attacks, this word prostitutes, you can even track this word. Mocha Uson starts to popularize prostitutes, Thinking Pinoy picks it up. Then it's repeated 1 million times to make you distrust institutions, to shift the way you think.
And so how do you actually deal with that? And how do we all hold the line? Because it's layered, right? If an action is taken in the Philippines, then it absolutely has an impact right here in the United States or in Brazil or in Hungary or any one of these countries where this is an increasing threat and existential, as you know, in your day-to-day existence.
Yeah. So this is like a chicken or egg question for me, right? I mean, and then I'll tell you how we dealt with it. I think at the beginning, we had democratic processes, elections. And because the information ecosystem had been turned upside down by the gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers, no longer journalists who protect the public sphere, they went to tech, and tech abdicated responsibility. So this kind of scorched earth policy to gain power happened. We elected these populist leaders who then essentially we put the fox in charge of the hen house, and because they had power, they were able to use not just the social media platforms. It's now part of the dictator's toolbox, right? It's the dictator's playbook now. But they also began to subvert these institutions from within. So how do we fight back? It's funny because so Rappler is a startup, and we're now coming up to 9 years old by January. And we have this Venn diagram you've seen me present forever, right? Which is technology, investigative journalism, and the last circle is community. So this is how we built Rappler, because in the end, the Rappler builds communities of action. Because I wanted to stop throwing stories into a black hole, and I wanted to do stories that helps our community take action, helps make democracy stronger. So here we are now, fast forward to 2020. How do we fix it? So the first let's fix the tech, right? So you can see this is kind of where we've been working on looking for policy decisions. We began working last year in Berlin. DFR Lab convened. I mean, amazing. Madeleine Albright, it was a great convening for a weekend, and to watch the way she worked, it was a great mix of people. And that was when I realized old power and new power just were not in the same world.
And not even speaking the same language, right?
Not the same language, exactly. And the entire world as we know it, the old power structures were being reduced to rubble, and the new people coming in with power had no idea what system. They had no laws that would work over societies, right? So tech, right? We now need regulation. We now need a way to think about it. Tech, finally, Facebook is taking action. I'm part of a group a month ago. In October, we began the Real Facebook Oversight Board to try to put more pressure on Facebook. And then the second thing is investigative journalists. We are going to have to help journalism survive. News organizations are caving in on two fronts. The first is that the same platforms that are now distributing news are the platforms being used to attack the credibility of news organizations. And the second is those same platforms have taken the lion's share of revenues. Facebook last quarter made $19 billion. That's incredibly huge, right? So anyway, so attack on two fronts. And then of course, forget government. Like, I have never lived through anything like what we're living through now. I actually survive it because I find it so fascinating. So I try very hard to get outside of myself and look at it and be fascinated and look for solutions, you know. And then the third part is, so we are going to have to help journalists, news organizations survive. I'm working with a group now that was put together by BBC Media Action Group, James Dean, along with Luminate. I think you're part of it, are you not, Graham? Like, we're trying to raise $1 billion a year to help independent media survive. And then the last part is, even as the journalists, and frankly, I think globally, the journalists have largely done their jobs. The risks have increased, the dangers have increased, and we keep doing our jobs. But now those stories have to reach our communities. And we are literally going to have to ask every person in a democracy to work to maintain democracy. Civil society has got to come together. And that's the other reason I like the Real Facebook Oversight Board, because there are human rights activists, there are, you know, civil rights activists who are working at this. We need to create networks of networks in the real world, in the physical world. I'm so worried that if things don't change, that a decade of fascism could come next. Madeleine Albright wrote this in her book, right?
Right.
And there's so many more now post that, but we're seeing this. It's the kinds of stuff, the kinds of attacks that I'm dealing with. A friend of mine who's German said, Maria, those things, that's the way the Germans attacked the Jews. They dehumanized them. So this is worrisome to me that we still haven't sounded the alarm.
For 1 second, set aside the fact that in many cases, in particularly your case, the government isn't upholding its end of the bargain to protect people and protect rights, right? In your case, the government is not an actor for good, for positive development, for the things that we kind of all rely on government to do and show up to do in a democracy. So set that aside, because that's a whole problem set at a scale and scope that is in many cases around the world unimaginable. And on the technology and the media side, it's this dichotomy that you're describing where, you know, Facebook is the internet in the Philippines, and on mobile devices, hours and hours and hours on YouTube and other streaming platforms. And that is the information ecosystem. And so rather than, you know, going home at the end of the day or watching the news at the very, very beginning of the day and having, or reading the newspaper on the bus to work or anything like that, it's the internet. And there you're in a constant competition for A, attention, and B, with those who would spread disinformation. And that's not a fair fight even a little bit. And so how do we not necessarily create new gatekeepers for information, but like sift through and upgrade or incentivize fact-based information or reliable information?
The social media platforms as is have got to change, because the data shows us that facts, news that you can use, that you know is reliable, cannot compete against the trash that it prioritizes, right? That's why I keep saying lies and emotion, lies laced with anger and hate. That is what flows fastest. So given this environment, you can't do that. Now, let's even look at the technology, right? What does it really do? What is this system? Because Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote Surveillance Capitalism, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, looks at all of these, the kind of the destruction of our privacy, data privacy, the disinformation, the lies that are killing democracy. She looks at this as the same problem, which is that, look, let me say it from my perspective. Each of us puts in post on Facebook. We'll put in our own data. Machine learning will come in and take the data we're putting in and create a model of who we are. That model will know us better than our most intimate relationship, will know us better than we know ourselves, because it's stripped, it's just the data of who we are, right? And then artificial intelligence comes in and pulls all of that data and takes our most vulnerable moment to a message and sells it to a company or a country. That is the market that Shoshana Zuboff says should be outlawed, that this is insidious manipulation. That is what the illiberal democracies, the Putins, the Duterte, this is what they have manipulated. And we can't fight back because the design of the platforms are done in a certain way. And certainly journalists, we don't even know how to fight back in an environment like that. So how do we deal with this? You stop the market for behavioral data. Look, the biggest difference between tech platforms and journalists organizations, news organizations focus on the craft, learning how to tell a story. You spend a lifetime learning how to catch someone's attention and make them care about a story. Tech platforms will take what they know about your brain and the way your instincts work and will look to manipulate you, to optimize so you will spend the most time on site. News groups just don't do that. And, I've been asked this before when we started looking at the bots. They were like, why don't you use bots? Why don't you use the things? Because it's unethical, because we shouldn't be doing that, right?
Right. One of the things that you said absolutely sticks out, and I don't think that it gets considered enough. You've now been tried for a case using a law that didn't exist when the alleged action happened, and for something that you weren't actually tangentially involved in. But when you look at the facts of your case in particular, it's so far outside of the law. It's laughable. It would be laughable if it wasn't so real.
Have you heard about this? This happened this week. So the palace released a matrix of coup plotters, and it includes my organization as well as other independent news groups and me. And now the Philippine National Police say they will investigate the journalists on that list. Do I have more support outside than inside the Philippines? I think we have a lot of support in the Philippines, but I think anyone who stands up has a lot to lose. Our country needs the mission of journalism even more today than at any other time.
How do you mentally prepare for that? I mean, there are actualities in your case in particular where, you try to do what the really, really good journalist in you always does, which is kind of take yourself out of the story and analyze it and kind of look at it. But how do you actually think through the day-to-day existence of that?
I mean, I saw the pattern starting in 2018, because January 2018, the government tried to shut Rappler down. They revoked our license to operate. We just fought back and we refused to shut down, and they really couldn't. So we weren't complicit in the abuse of power, of the abuse of our rights. But then in 2018, the government filed 11 cases against us. Mm-hmm. And then in 2019, I have 8 criminal cases and 8 arrest warrants that year. And trials that started, there were weeks when I would be in 4 different courtrooms in a week. If I pull up again, I know that if the pattern continues, I will lose all the cases. I mean, I hope that's not the case, and I continue to appeal to the judges and the justices who touch my case to go to the spirit of the law. But the reality is, as a journalist looking at this, I'll go, so what did I do? I was like, well, I'm going to have to stand up, and I'm going to have to challenge this political harassment. And I'm going to have faith that our courts will stick to the spirit of the law. But in case something goes wrong, Amal Clooney is there, right? So this is, I guess this is why I also learned that every battle in this fight for democracy is both local and global. The battle on social media is local and global. The decisions made in Silicon Valley flowed to us and were felt far worse. The damage was worse in the global South. And yet nothing will change until America feels it. And now you're feeling it and you see things changing. So local and global, the world is changing in front of our eyes. And COVID-19 has destroyed the world we knew. I think we're standing on the rubble of the world that was. And it's only our minds that's trying to connect us to the past. And I think we're faced with the challenge of, okay, it's all destroyed. You're standing on the rubble. What are you going to do? What kind of world do you want to create?
Well, and that comes back to holding the line. What every single one of us can do to hold the line in the face of 1,000 cuts, to bring back to where we started, right? I mean, it's one of these things where when you're faced with 1,000 cuts and you need to make a decision, then do you have 1,000 defenses? And your approach includes, every single response from every single angle. And that's the right approach. But for every single one of us, what can we all do to hold the line? And not just, as journalists or as think tankers or as, people that think about this on a day-to-day basis because that is our job. But every single one of us has a collective responsibility to hold that line in a democracy. Otherwise, it won't be a democracy for that long.
So I think every generation gets the democracy it deserves, right? And I think, you're younger than I am, but like I grew up at a time when it seemed like the world democracy would win. The fall of the Berlin Wall, people power in the Philippines in 1986 seemed to have sparked global people power movements, right? I spent most of my career looking at Southeast Asia turning from authoritarian one-man rule to democracy. And then now at the tail end, it's coming right back. So look, I think the question we need to ask, if you're living in a democracy, is you have to realize that it isn't just voting. You can't stop with voting. Voting is just the beginning, that you cannot look away. That right now you have to ask yourself, what are you willing to sacrifice for the rights that democracy gives you, right? Like, it's a question I had to ask myself, and I answered it very, very early on. I didn't realize it was really going to happen, you know.
You didn't realize you're going to have to live that out?
I mean, I didn't realize it was going to get this bad. When we were being pressured, when there was a Damocles sword being hung over us in 2016, when I was getting attacked on social media and then the government would come in, I was like, this case is so ludicrous. It should never make it to court. And well, it did. And I was convicted. Who would have thought? But I guess the reason why I continue is I already fought that battle 3 years ago. I already know what I'm willing to sacrifice, because in the end, that's why we created Rappler. We created Rappler to do independent journalism, and it matters now far more than it ever did. And little Rappler, I think the fact that we exist and that we continue to do accountability journalism helps other Filipinos hold the line, right? And it's a perpetual cycle. Courage spreads. Courage, like fear, spreads. And I think that when fear is used as a weapon, you have to stand up and say no, and draw on these fundamental. It's part of human nature. Again, we've done this before, and we will do it again, I hope.
Maria, I can't thank you enough for taking all this time. Every single time we talk, A, I am inspired. B, we all learn so much, and we're all beneficiaries of your example. And your time is precious. And I can't thank you enough for doing this for in the morning here in the United States, and in the evening, I'm drinking coffee. This is a coffee talk, so there's that. But I know that it's at the end of your day, and we have a lot more work to do. It's very clear from our conversation, and not only work on the day-to-day of fighting for facts, absolutely, and it is very much a fight for facts, but also on how we, to your point, exactly what we do from here. If we have this opportunity, and that's the beautiful thing about free and open societies, is that we get to choose. And so the end note is a choice, and it's a collective choice that we all get to participate in, but it's all up to us to do that. I also have to end by saying, if you haven't checked out 1,000 Cuts, you have to watch it. It's a must watch. If you are kind of struggling with the details of exactly what we talked about, the movie unpacks every single kind of angle of it. It's extremely illuminating. You need to know the story. And we all need to know that story. So Maria, seriously, I thank you again.
No, thank you for having me. It's always great to talk to you, Graham.
Thanks, Maria.